My name is Danielle Avery. I'm 31 years old, and until recently, I was sleeping on a pull-out mattress in a one-bedroom apartment above a closed-down laundromat, eating ramen 3 times a week and praying the ceiling wouldn't leak again. That's where I was the night my grandfather called me from a bus station, alone, broke, and shaking. He was 84 years old, and he had just been kicked out of my uncle's $1 million lakeside home, the same uncle he had trusted with everything, the same man who had stood in our family dining room 6 months before and sworn hand over heart, "Of course I'll take care of Dad. You don't need to worry." Grandpa believed him, and for that belief, he ended up stranded in the freezing wind with nothing but a worn coat and a suitcase full of faded photographs. Not even $1 to his name. I remember staring at my cracked phone screen that night, listening to Grandpa's voice tremble as he said, "I don't know where to go, Danny. They said I'm a burden. They told me to leave." I dropped everything, threw on the nearest coat, ran down the stairs 2 at a time, and drove across town like my car could outrun my fury. I didn't care that my gas tank was nearly empty. I didn't care that I had less than $80 in my bank account. What mattered was that the man who raised me, who taught me how to tie my shoes and drive a stick shift and plant tomatoes in a crooked garden bed, was sitting in the cold with no place to go. And the people who put him there? They were sitting in a mansion built on his money. You probably think I'm exaggerating, that no one would do something so heartless to their own father. But I lived it. And if you've ever been the one in your family who watched quietly while others played the heroes, if you've ever been called ungrateful, too emotional, too dramatic for speaking up, you'll understand why I can't forget what happened, or forgive it. It started long before Grandpa ever made that phone call. Looking back now, I realize the seeds were sown the day he sold our family farm. 3 generations, over 200 acres of wheat and corn. My childhood summers spent running through rows of tall stalks while Grandpa grilled corn on the cob and whistled some old tune no one else remembered. He sold it all after Grandma passed away, said the place was too lonely without her. We all cried, even Uncle Charles. But he recovered faster than anyone else. In fact, within a week of the sale, he was at Grandpa's front door with a real estate brochure and a spreadsheet. "I can help manage the funds, Dad," he said smoothly, brushing imaginary lint from his Armani blazer. "You shouldn't have to worry about money at your age." He was right, of course. Grandpa shouldn't have had to worry, but maybe he should have worried more about Charles. Because what he didn't realize was that my uncle didn't want to help manage the money. He wanted to own it, every last dollar. When Grandpa agreed to move in with him, when he handed over access to his accounts, his will, his trust documents, I don't think he thought twice. Charles was his firstborn, his success story, a real estate developer with a waterfront property and enough charm to convince anyone he had their best interests at heart. And for a while, everything seemed fine, at least on the outside. Grandpa's Christmas cards came on time. Charles posted the occasional photo of Grandpa on social media, smiling at a Thanksgiving table or sipping coffee by the lake. But behind closed doors, there were signs, quiet signs. His voice was more
Grandpa's
subdued.
calls to me got
He
shorter.
once asked if I still had a spare bedroom, then laughed it off when I said yes. And then one night, he didn't laugh. He just said, "I miss Minnesota. I miss people who see me." I should have known something was wrong, but I was too busy trying to stay afloat myself. Working 2 part-time jobs and bootstrapping a startup that everyone, including Charles, said was naive. "You're building farm software?" he once scoffed. "Danielle, the only people who still farm are broke. Come work for me instead." I said no, because Grandpa had taught me that dreams aren't foolish if you believe in them hard enough. And then came the phone call. A quiet Tuesday night. I had just gotten off a double shift and was trying to decide whether I had enough energy to cook or just heat up another frozen burrito. My phone buzzed. Grandpa. He was breathless, confused. I could hear the wind whipping in the background. Danny, they said I have to go. I packed a few things, but they were yelling and I didn't want to cause trouble. I don't remember much else. Just that my hands were shaking, that I barely stopped at red lights, that when I pulled up to the bus station and saw him standing there, hunched over, his suitcase held together with duct tape, I wanted to scream. Instead, I opened the passenger door and said the only thing I could get past the lump in my throat. "You're safe now." He moved in with me that night, and though I didn't have much, a creaky mattress, a broken heater, 2 mugs that didn't match, I gave him everything I could. For the first time in a year, he slept without being scolded for breathing too loudly. He drank his coffee without hearing that he was costing someone too much. He started smiling again. And then one morning, over oatmeal, he handed me a folded piece of paper and said, "I've made some changes." It was his will. And the twist? The money? It had never fully left his hands. He never told Charles the truth. He never told anyone the truth. He had been waiting, watching, deciding who truly cared. And in the end, he left everything to me. But that's not even the part that destroyed Charles. What happened at the reading of the will? What was revealed in front of lawyers and notaries and stunned family members? That's what cracked the facade my uncle had spent his life building. And that's where this story is going next. Because if you think the betrayal was bad, wait until you hear how karma showed up in a tailored suit and handed Charles the one thing he never saw coming. If you've ever watched someone you love be mistreated by the very people who claim to care, if you've ever been overlooked while others stole credit, stole affection, stole inheritance, then you already know this isn't just my story. It might be yours too. So keep reading. Like this if you've ever had to protect someone you love. Comment if you've ever been the unnoticed one who saw everything. And share this if you believe justice sometimes comes quietly, with a final signature on a folded piece of paper. There's something about the way people speak your name when they've already made up their minds about who you are. I grew up hearing mine like a cautionary tale. Danielle? Oh, she's bright, sure, but a little too soft, too idealistic. The kind of girl who builds things that don't make money. And Charles? He was the success story, the golden son, the man who made things happen. He wore pressed shirts, had a firm handshake, and spoke in confident sound bites like what came out of his mouth was half true or borrowed. People believed him because they wanted to. My mother used to say, Charles could sell sand in the desert. I didn't understand what she meant when I was younger. Now I do. He didn't just sell sand. He sold it to Grandpa and called it security. When Grandpa sold the farm, I knew it was going to be hard on him. That land wasn't just dirt and rows of corn. It was a lifetime of sweat and memory, the place where he met Grandma. Where I first learned to read, sitting cross-legged on the porch with a popsicle dripping down my arm. But after Grandma passed, he got quiet. The house felt like a mausoleum, and I think the silence started to wear on him. Charles offered a solution. "Dad," he said, leaning back in his sleek leather chair during one of their rare family dinners, "you shouldn't have to spend your final years wandering a creaky farmhouse. Come live with me. Let me take care of things." It sounded so noble. Grandpa nodded, misty-eyed, moved by the offer. I said nothing. Because who was I to question it? I was just the broke granddaughter with startup dreams and a coffee-stained hoodie. What no one saw, but what I started piecing together later, was that Charles had been planning this move for a long time. First came the call to a financial advisor he conveniently knew through a friend. Then the quick conversations Grandpa didn't think to question. "I just need access to the checking account to make life easier for you, Dad. Let me update the documents, just in case something happens to you. You don't need to worry about taxes. I've got someone on it." It was all wrapped in sugar, and Grandpa? He was tired, grieving. He wasn't thinking like the tough farmer who once fought off a wildfire with a shovel and a garden hose. He just wanted peace. And Charles made peace sound like a luxury cruise. So the move happened. And just like that, my grandfather, who had survived wars, floods, and droughts, was now living in a gated lakefront property with a man who called him Pop in public and ignored him in private. The calls slowed. When I visited, Charles acted like I was interrupting some high-level meeting. He'd barely look up from his phone. Grandpa would smile, but there was a sadness in his eyes I didn't understand back then. One afternoon, I caught Charles snapping at him in the kitchen. "Dad, if you can't stop dripping tea on the marble, I'll just put a tray under your cup, all right?" His tone was flat, annoyed, like Grandpa was an inconvenience. Grandpa laughed softly, like it didn't matter, but I saw the way he clenched his jaw. That night, I asked him if everything was okay. He gave me a long look and said, "You ever feel like you're a guest in a house that used to be your own?" I didn't understand it then, but I would. 1 week later, I came over with a pie, Grandpa's favorite, rhubarb. I found him alone in the sunroom, staring out at the lake. "Charles is out?" I asked. He nodded. "He works late a lot these days," he said. "Always something urgent." I noticed he was thinner. There were more blankets on the couch. He looked smaller. He never used to look small, and something inside me twisted with unease. "You okay, Grandpa?" I asked again. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, Sweet Pea." But the way he said it sounded like a goodbye. At first glance, everything in Charles's home gleamed. The polished countertops,
aligned picture
the
frames
floors, showing his smiling face next to people with power and influence. Even Grandpa's room looked pristine, tastefully decorated, with a leather armchair by the window and a bookshelf full of gifts Charles had ordered online. It was the kind of setup you'd expect to see on a brochure for luxury assisted living, but all that shine was just a glaze. Beneath it were hairline cracks, growing wider each day, and it started showing in the way Grandpa moved. He walked slower, flinched more, smiled less. Once, during dinner, he knocked over a glass of water, and Charles's reaction wasn't just frustration. It was fury, barely contained behind gritted teeth. "For God's sake, Dad," he snapped, grabbing a towel. "This table was custom-made. Can you please be more careful?" Grandpa just nodded, silent. I sat across from them, frozen, gripping my fork so tightly my fingers went numb. The air hung heavy between us, and I wanted so badly to say something, but I didn't. I couldn't, because I wasn't family in that house. Not really. I was tolerated. A quiet outsider with too much heart and not enough status. After that night, I started visiting more often. Not because I was welcome, but because I needed to see Grandpa with my own eyes, to know he was okay. And each time, he looked a little more faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun. His voice lost its old cadence, that warm timbre that used to tell me bedtime stories about foxes and cornfields. His sentences got shorter, more distant. Once, while I helped him sort through a few things in his closet, he turned to me suddenly and asked, "Do you think Charles regrets me living here?" I was stunned. My first instinct was to say, "Of course not." But I couldn't lie. Not to him. Not anymore. "I think Charles cares more about what people think than how people feel," I said softly. Grandpa didn't respond. He just stared at the window, his reflection faint in the glass. Then came the whispers about money, little things at first. A missing medication refill, a canceled doctor's appointment. "Just a scheduling issue," Charles claimed, but when I offered to take Grandpa to his next checkup, Charles's expression changed, like a shutter slamming down. "No need, we've got it under control," he said. But there was no we, it was just Charles, controlling everything. That's when I started asking questions. Not to Charles, he'd only deflect, but to people around the house. The maid, who barely spoke English, told me that Grandpa's meals had changed lately. "Less meat," she whispered. "Smaller." The driver, an older man named Reggie, who'd worked for Charles for years, told me that Grandpa hadn't left the house in over 2 weeks. I asked Grandpa about it, and he shrugged. "I don't want to be a bother," he said. That's when it hit me. He wasn't just being controlled. He was being erased, slowly, quietly, with a smile. I tried confronting Charles once. It was late, just the two of us in the kitchen. The smell of scotch still lingered in the air from his third glass. "I'm worried about Grandpa," I said. He looked up from his phone, barely blinking. "Why? He's got a roof over his head, food on the table, and a view of the lake. You think he had it better out in Minnesota, shoveling snow off the roof at 83? "It's not about comfort," I replied carefully. "It's about dignity." He scoffed, tossing his phone on the counter. "Dignity? Please. Danielle, you've always had this bleeding heart complex. Life's about making tough calls.
My wife's
You don't
furious.
think I've sacrificed
My
business is stretched thin. And do you know how expensive elder care is? He should be grateful." My hands clenched at my sides. "He is grateful. But you're not doing this out of love. You're doing it for the optics." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You have no idea what I've done to keep this family together. You want to help? Then stop meddling." I didn't respond, because I realized then that Charles didn't see Grandpa as a father. He saw him as a burden, a public relations asset wrapped in aging skin. I went home that night with fire in my chest. I looked around my own tiny apartment with its creaky floors and mismatched furniture, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ashamed, not of the space, but of myself, for being too passive, too cautious, too late. I made a promise to myself that night, staring at the ceiling with my fists clenched beneath the blanket. I would not let Grandpa fade away, not under Charles's roof, not while I had breath in my body. The next morning, I showed up unannounced. Grandpa was in the backyard, bundled in a flannel jacket, sitting alone in the shade. I sat beside him. We didn't talk much, just listened to the wind rustling the tall grass by the lake. Then he reached for my hand and whispered, "I miss your grandma." I squeezed his fingers. "I do too." "And I miss my farm," he added. "Not the land, the feeling, the freedom." His eyes were glossy. "But I sold all that, didn't I?" he said bitterly. I looked at him, heart aching. "You sold it for peace." He smiled faintly. "Then why do I feel like I bought a prison?" The next time Grandpa called me, it wasn't to talk about the weather or how the Cardinals were doing, or even to ask how my startup was going. It was to ask for a flashlight. A flashlight. Not because the power had gone out, but because Charles had started locking the hallway lights at night to conserve electricity. Grandpa didn't want to stumble in the dark on the way to the bathroom, said he'd tripped once already, didn't want to make a scene. I didn't say anything at first. I just sat there holding my phone, swallowing the lump in my throat. That was the moment the scales tipped. That was the moment I knew Grandpa wasn't just uncomfortable. He was scared, humiliated. He was living in a mansion with polished floors and quartz countertops and custom fireplaces, but he was treated like a tenant overstaying his welcome, like an unwanted guest in a house built with his own sacrifice. That week, I started planning, quietly. I didn't tell anyone, not my friends, not my co-workers, not even Grandpa. I needed time, and more importantly, I needed a place, because the room above the laundromat, that was no place for a man his age. The floor sagged. The heater groaned like it was dying every night. The stairs were steep, and the bathroom door didn't close properly. Grandpa would never say it, but I knew he deserved better, and yet it was the only option I had. So I started prepping. I cleared out the junk I'd stored under the fold-out couch, scrubbed the floors, bought a second-hand space heater on Facebook Marketplace for $40, and spent another $10 on a used microwave. I found an old cot online and picked it up with my last tank of gas. Each night, while Charles was drinking his wine by the fireplace, I was elbow-deep in baking soda and vinegar, trying to fix a broken faucet in my makeshift kitchenette. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't care, because this wasn't just a rescue. Evening, I stopped by Charles's house under the pretense of dropping off Grandpa's vitamins. He wasn't home. His wife, Alyssa, answered the door, her voice flat as ever. "He's in the back, probably napping or watching birds or something," she said, waving me in like she was shooing a fly. I found Grandpa in the sunroom, staring out at the water. His cane was propped beside him, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't look surprised to see me, just relieved, like he'd been hoping I'd show up. We sat in silence for a moment, watching the lake glimmer. Then he spoke. "Danny, can I ask you something? Anything. If I left here, would I be a burden?" The question hit like a punch in the stomach. "No," I said immediately. "Never." He nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he'd been turning over for weeks. "I've been thinking about leaving," he whispered. "I just didn't want you to feel responsible." "I already feel responsible," I said gently. "Not because I have to, but because I want to." "You're not a project, Grandpa. You're my family." He looked down, blinking quickly, and I swear for a second I thought he might cry. That night, we made a plan. We didn't write it down, didn't say it too loud, just small, whispered steps over lukewarm tea and cautious glances. I'd come back Sunday afternoon when Charles was out at his golf club. Grandpa would have his bag packed, just a few essentials. I'd wait by the garden gate, the one that creaked like a horror movie prop. And just like that, we'd leave. No fight, no confrontation, no drama, just freedom. But Saturday night something changed. Charles called me. Late. Too late. "Danielle," he said, his voice tight, "I don't know what you've been putting in Dad's head, but he's been acting strange. You haven't been feeding him your usual guilt-ridden nonsense, have you?" My pulse quickened. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said flatly. He laughed, low and bitter. "You think you know better than me? You, with your little food delivery job and your half-baked app idea? You don't know what it takes to run a life, Danielle. You don't know the cost. I know it shouldn't include disrespect." There was a pause. Then quietly, almost too calmly, he said, "Stay away from this house. and he hung up. I drove there anyway the next day, because threats don't scare me. And Grandpa? He was already waiting at the gate. His coat buttoned all wrong, his bag too small, his eyes more alive than I'd seen in months. When I pulled up, he didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the car, got in, and didn't look back. Not even once. We drove in silence for a while. Then he turned to me and asked, "Do you think I made a mistake?" I knew what he meant. Trusting Charles, selling the farm, leaving the place where every tree and stone had his fingerprints on it. "No," I said. "You made a decision with your heart. That's not a mistake." He nodded slowly, and then he smiled. Not a polite smile, not a forced one, but a real one. The kind I hadn't seen in far too long. That night, in my tiny upstairs apartment, Grandpa slept in the cot I'd set up in the corner. I curled up on the couch, exhausted but content. I didn't know how we'd get by. Rent was overdue. My startup was a long shot. But we were together, and for the first time in months, I knew he felt seen. The next few weeks blurred into one long stretch of cold mornings, reheated coffee. I'd wake up early to drive deliveries before sunrise, return by mid-morning to brew Grandpa his favorite dark roast, and then spend my afternoons working on the app, tapping out lines of code on a donated laptop while Grandpa read the newspaper from the community center. We made it work, not because it was easy, but because we chose to. Grandpa never once complained about the creaky cot or the peeling paint. He didn't care that our meals were mostly toast and canned soup. What mattered was that he was treated with respect, that he was free, and yet, even in the safety of our tiny apartment, a shadow hung over us. Charles. He hadn't called since that last night. But we both knew he wasn't finished, not with Grandpa, and definitely not with the money. One afternoon, I came home to find Grandpa pacing slowly in the living room, a letter in his hand. His brow furrowed. I knew that look. "What is it?" I asked, dropping my keys on the table. He handed me the envelope without a word. It was from a law firm in Nashville, Charles's. A formal notice. They were contesting Grandpa's capacity, claiming undue influence, accusing me of manipulating him in his old age. I read it 3 times before I spoke. "He's accusing you of being mentally unfit," I said finally, my voice thin. Grandpa sighed and sat down slowly. "I figured this would happen. He's trying to take back control." He nodded. Silence settled between us, thick and bitter. I looked at him, really looked, and realized how tired he was. Not physically, but soul-deep tired. Tired of being seen as property. Tired of being measured in dollar signs. Tired of having to defend his own choices like a child with a crayon drawing. He wasn't angry, he was disappointed, and that was worse. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the couch, eyes fixed on the ceiling, counting the faint hums of traffic outside. Every second that passed made my chest tighter. It wasn't just the legal threat. It was the audacity, the arrogance, the belief that love could be purchased and withdrawn based on who held the purse strings. I thought about Charles, sitting in his high-rise office, sipping imported whiskey, telling his lawyers how ungrateful Grandpa had become. And I made a decision. I was done playing polite. The next morning, I went straight to the public library and printed out every financial document Grandpa had saved. The land deed, the sale contract, the bank records, proving the money from the farm had never been fully handed over, only partially accessed through a shared account Charles had eventually drained. And then I contacted someone I never thought I'd need, Miss Rachel Gibson, an old family friend, a retired probate attorney who used to bake me lemon squares and tell me that truth always wins if you're patient and precise. When I told her what happened, she didn't flinch. "I believe you," she said, folding her hands, "and more importantly, I believe him." She reviewed the documents, made a few calls, and nodded. "We have enough to make a case." "For what?" I asked. "For exactly what your grandfather deserves," she replied. "Freedom, legally sealed, irrefutably clear." In the days that followed, I watched something remarkable happen. Grandpa started walking straighter. His eyes got brighter. He even made jokes again, real ones, not the hollow chuckles he used to give when Charles was around. There was one morning when he asked me to cut his hair, and we both ended up laughing so hard at the crooked sideburns that he spit coffee all over the floor. For a moment, we forgot about Charles. But of course, the past has a way of showing up at the door. And it did. On a rainy Thursday morning, while Grandpa was napping, I heard a knock. I opened the door to find Charles, standing there in his tailored coat, drenched, but still managing to look smug. He didn't ask to come in. He just brushed past me and stepped inside like he still owned something. "I'm here to see Dad," he said. I blocked the hallway. "You can't just walk in like this." He looked me over with a sneer. "Still playing house in this dump?" I didn't answer, because I didn't need to. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think he's going to choose you over me?" "He already did," I said. His nostrils flared. "He's confused, weak. You took advantage of that." "I didn't take advantage of anything. I gave him dignity, something you threw away." He looked ready to argue, but then a voice came from behind me. "Charles?" We both turned. Grandpa stood at the end of the hallway, leaning on his cane. He looked smaller than I remembered, paler. But his eyes? Sharp, focused, unmistakably clear. Charles forced a smile. "Dad, I was just checking on you." Grandpa didn't smile back. "You're not welcome here," he said quietly. Charles froze. The silence was thunderous. "Dad!" I said, "Leave." Charles's face twisted, hurt, angry, embarrassed. But he didn't argue. Not this time. He turned and walked out without another word. The door closed, and just like that, something in the air shifted. Final, complete. Grandpa sat down slowly, his hand trembling just slightly. "That was the last piece," he said, "the last tie." And I knew exactly what he meant. A week later, Rachel filed the new will. A new power of attorney, a full transfer of legal control, to me, authorized and notarized in front of witnesses from our building, including Mr. Dell from downstairs who cried when he heard the story. And on that same day, Charles's lawyer called. They wanted to resolve the matter privately. We declined. As I sat beside Grandpa that night, watching the city lights flicker outside our tiny window, I realized something. This wasn't just the story of a fortune nearly stolen. It was the story of a legacy nearly erased and rescued, quietly, patiently, by love that didn't need validation from courts or cash. But still, justice was coming, and it would arrive, not with fists or threats, but with paperwork and truth. It wasn't in a courtroom. It wasn't on some grand stage or in the middle of a dramatic confrontation like you see in movies. The moment everything changed, when the truth surfaced and Charles's mask slipped, it happened in the quiet office of a downtown notary, where the scent of dust and ink hung in the air and the chairs squeaked when you leaned back. Rachel had set it up. "We'll do it legally, neutrally, no room for spin," she said. We all arrived separately. I came with Grandpa in a borrowed Honda Civic, the window sticking and the heater making a low whine. Charles arrived 10 minutes late, of course, in a slick black SUV with tinted windows. He walked in with his chest puffed, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than our rent for the year. He didn't look at me, didn't even glance at Grandpa, but I could feel his smugness filling the room like smoke. He thought he was here to win. The notary, a thin woman with kind eyes and a clipboard that never left her hands, today for the formal reading and recording of George Avery's will and associated documents, with witnesses present as required by state law. "Mr. Avery, are you comfortable proceeding?" Grandpa nodded. His hand rested gently on mine. He didn't say much that day, but he didn't need to. His presence was its own declaration. Charles folded his arms. "I still don't understand why we're doing this. I already have a copy of the estate plan." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "You have a copy, not the final one." Something flickered behind his eyes. He shifted in his seat. The notary opened the file. Her voice was clear, steady. "George Avery, being of sound mind and body, executed a full legal revision of his last will and testament on the 3rd of October of this year, witnessed, notarized, and verified." Charles leaned forward, his jaw tight. No, the last will was signed in February. We, my legal team and I, we already filed that. She didn't blink. "Sir, that document has been superseded." Rachel slid a second envelope across the table. "This is the official record," she said, "filed with the county. This is what stands." The notary continued. "To my son, Charles Avery, I leave the contents of the property located at 28 Harbor Lane. This includes furnishings, decor, and personal items acquired after 2020, with the exception of heirlooms." Charles smirked, clearly relieved. I could almost see the words forming in his head. I knew it. I always win. But then she read the next line. "To my granddaughter, Danielle Avery, I leave full rights to all remaining financial assets, including but not limited to the residuals from the Avery farmland sale, the mineral rights under parcel ID number 8403, the private family trust initiated by Margaret Avery in 1978, and all remaining intellectual property, estate interests, and executor authority." The room fell silent. You could hear the buzz of the ceiling light. Charles blinked. "What?" The notary continued. "This transfer includes, by legal designation, all remaining unaccessed funds, inheritance equity, and ownership rights, to be handled at her discretion, without oversight." His voice rose. "Are you kidding me?" He stood up, knocking the chair back with a screech. "Dad, what is this? This isn't the agreement we had." Grandpa finally looked at him, and his voice, though soft, cut like a blade. "There was no agreement, Charles. There was trust, and you broke it." Charles was fuming now. "This is manipulation. She coerced you. You were living in a hovel. You were confused." Rachel tapped the table lightly. "I would advise you to lower your tone. This is theft." "No," Grandpa said calmly. "What you did was theft. What I did was take back what mattered and give it to the person who never asked me for a thing." Charles's face twisted. "You're making a mistake." "No," Grandpa said again. "I'm finally correcting one." He stormed out. Didn't even stay for the signature verification. Didn't shake hands. Didn't say goodbye. And just like that, the man who had manipulated, schemed, and bullied his way through every room he entered, was gone. And I was still sitting there, holding Grandpa's hand, tears pooling in my eyes, not because of the money, but because of what it meant. He saw me. He believed in me. And he trusted me with the legacy he nearly lost. After Charles stormed out of that office, silence wrapped around us like a thick wool blanket. Grandpa and I didn't speak for a long while. We just sat there, side by side, letting the truth settle between us like dust in a shaft, like something sacred had just taken place, and maybe it had. He didn't give me an empire. He gave me vindication. He gave me his trust back. And for a man like Grandpa, that was worth more than any bank account. Rachel offered to take us home, but Grandpa insisted we walk. So we strolled, slowly, down Main Street. The wind was brisk, rustling the last golden leaves from the trees, and Grandpa leaned on his cane with a bit more strength than I'd seen in weeks. "You think he'll come back?" I asked as we passed a coffee shop with fogged-up windows. Grandpa didn't answer right away. "I think he already got what he came for," he said at last. I looked at him confused. "Control," he added. "That's all Charles ever really wanted. And when he realized he lost it, for good, that's when the illusion shattered." I nodded slowly. It made sense. But I also knew men like Charles didn't go down without noise. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, an email arrived from one of Charles's attorneys, an official contestation filing. He was challenging the validity of the new will, citing undue influence, elder abuse, and diminished mental capacity. I almost laughed at the absurdity, especially the part about Grandpa being easily manipulated. This was a man who once ran a farm through 3 back-to-back droughts and still paid every worker on time, who read the newspaper every morning cover to cover and still corrected my grammar when I spoke too fast. But now, suddenly, because Charles didn't get what he wanted, Grandpa was unstable? I printed the letter and took it to Rachel. She read it once and sighed. "He's panicking. Should we be worried?" "No," she said firmly, "but we should be ready." That weekend, the doorbell rang at 7 a.m. It was a process server. I accepted the papers and closed the door, heart pounding. "Is it him?" Grandpa asked, already awake, sitting in his chair with a blanket over his knees. I held up the manila envelope. "Yep." He nodded slowly, then smiled. I figured. "You're not upset?" He looked me square in the eyes. "I'm tired of being upset. Let him waste his time. We've already won." But something inside me stirred. A fire I hadn't realized was still burning. Because this wasn't just about Charles trying to claw back money. This was about reputation, about him trying to rewrite the truth because he couldn't stand the idea of not being the center of the story. Well, he wasn't. Not anymore. The legal mess stretched for weeks. Charles filed paperwork, then withdrew it. He tried negotiating through mutual acquaintances. He even sent flowers. Yes, flowers, to Grandpa with a handwritten note that said, "Let's find peace while we still can." Grandpa tossed them in the trash without a word. "I know what peace feels like," he said, "and it doesn't smell like roses from someone who sold me out." By then, people were starting to talk. Neighbors who once fawned over Charles began reaching out to me, asking what really happened. One even dropped off a pie with a note that said, "For the only Avery with integrity left." It wasn't about gloating. It was about balance. And for once, the truth was tilting the scale in our favor. One morning, Grandpa asked to take a walk around the old co-op building we'd been eyeing as potential office space for my app. "Feels like something's beginning," he said, glancing at the peeling paint and broken windows. "Not ending." I smiled, because he was right. We weren't just reclaiming what was lost. We were building something new. The final push. Something honest. Charles filed one last petition, this time accusing me of exploiting Grandpa to gain business funding. That one stung, because it wasn't just petty. It was calculated. He knew my company meant something to me. He knew it was the one thing I was building entirely on my own. And now he wanted to poison it. I sat on the floor of the apartment that night, documents spread around me, heart racing. Tears threatened to rise, but I blinked them back. I wouldn't give him that, not even in private. Grandpa watched me from across the room. "You know," he said gently, "you don't have to carry all this alone." I looked at him, my voice thick. "If I don't carry it, who will?" He stood slowly and walked over, resting his hand on my shoulder. "You already carried me farther than I deserved. Let me return the favor." And he did. The next day he recorded a video, just him, sitting in his chair, speaking plainly into the camera. He explained everything: the farm sale, the money, the choice to stay with Charles, the abuse that followed, the decision to leave, and finally, why he chose to revise the will. No lawyers, no drama, just truth. We uploaded it as part of our legal filing and also sent a copy to several family members who were still in the dark. It wasn't loud, but it was seismic. By the end of the week, Charles withdrew everything. No apology, no explanation, just silence. For once, that was enough. There was no parade, no spotlight, no grand announcement that echoed through town or made the evening news. Just silence. The kind of silence that wraps itself around your shoulders like a warm quilt. Soft, steady, and finally free of the constant noise of accusation, betrayal, and fear. Charles withdrew the petition. The legal war he tried to ignite flickered out with barely a whimper. The courts confirmed what we already knew. The will was valid, the transfer legal, Grandpa fully competent when he made his decision. The video sealed it. And in the absence of his threats, for the first time in months, we exhaled. It wasn't a celebration. It was more like a letting go. A quiet Sunday morning, Grandpa and I walked to the nearby farmer's market. He shuffled beside me with his cane, nodding at neighbors who now looked him in the eye again, guilt and awkward sympathy lingering in their smiles. No one said Charles's name. They didn't have to. His absence in their words said more than anything else. At one stall, an old vendor offered Grandpa a free jar of wildflower honey. "For standing up," he said, "even when it wasn't easy." Grandpa smiled, but I could see the sadness behind his eyes, because while he had won the battle, it had cost him a son. Back at the apartment, we sat on the balcony with chipped mugs and lukewarm coffee. Fall was easing into winter. The wind had a bite to it, but Grandpa didn't seem to mind. "Do you regret any of it?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow sip, then looked out toward the skyline, graying and quiet. "I regret who he became," he said softly, "but not what I did." I nodded, letting his words settle, because that was the truth no one wanted to say aloud. Sometimes the people we love choose a version of themselves that we cannot follow, and the kindest thing we can do is walk away, even if it breaks our hearts. After the storm passed, something unexpected happened. People started reaching out. Not just friends or extended family, but small business owners, local farmers, even former clients who had once worked with Charles. They wanted to help and now felt
They wanted to invest, not in me necessarily, but in what Grandpa had chosen to believe in. My app, the one Charles mocked, the one I coded between double shifts and late-night tears, started gaining traction. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. FarmLink, a digital tool connecting small, local farms directly with restaurants and co-ops, bypassing middlemen and empowering community agriculture. Grandpa became my unofficial brand ambassador. He wore the t-shirt. He pitched it to anyone within earshot. He even handed out flyers at the market, designed by my granddaughter, he'd say, proudly puffing out his chest like he'd just landed me a spot on the cover of Forbes. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Charles had once dismissed the idea as naive idealism, yet here we were, standing in the ashes of his empire, building something out of nothing. And this time it was built on dignity, on truth, on love that didn't need power to prove its worth. A few weeks later, a letter arrived, not from Charles, from his wife, Alyssa. It was short, 2 lines. He's lost everything. Blames you, of course, but between us, I think you saved your grandfather's life. Thank you. I didn't know how to feel. Relieved? Vindicated? Sad? All of it, maybe. Because while we were finally free, Charles was still trapped in the same maze of pride and image he'd built for himself. Grandpa never gloated, not once, and I never spoke Charles's name again in front of him. We let the silence hold the weight of everything we didn't say. But every time I poured Grandpa his morning coffee, every time I saw him smile at the market, every time he looked at me like I was the best thing he'd ever invested in, I knew the truth, that quiet victories are often the most powerful, because they don't roar, they whisper, and they change the world anyway. You always think the loudest moment will be the one where truth is revealed, like the will reading or the courtroom or that final confrontation at the door. But in my case, the loudest moment was the silence that came after. Because once the dust settled, people started talking, quietly at first, then more openly, and the truth, our truth, began to echo through the very same community that once praised Charles like a hometown celebrity. The whispers at the country club, the side glances at Sunday brunch. Even the bank tellers who once bent over backwards to serve him started to greet him with polite, strained smiles. His empire didn't just collapse financially, it collapsed socially. People didn't trust him anymore. Because once you manipulate your own father, your own family, people start to wonder what you'd do to them too. I didn't take pleasure in that. I want to be clear. I didn't watch him unravel and cheer, but I didn't stop it either. Because some consequences are earned. And Charles, he'd earned every moment of that slow, isolating fall. It started with the investors. Once they caught wind of the will drama, they began pulling out of his real estate fund. Fast. Half of them cited reputational concern, and the other half didn't even bother offering a reason. They just disappeared. Then the city put a hold on his latest development project, citing zoning violations that had long been ignored. With no financial backing and no legal wiggle room, the project died on the vine. His second wife left shortly after, packed up her things and took the dog, the gym membership, and, ironically, the espresso machine he once mocked Grandpa
was a
for
condo
not knowing
filled
how to
with
use.
glass furniture and a liquor cabinet he'd stocked for guests who no longer came. Meanwhile, my life was quiet, better, full of small, meaningful victories. FarmLink officially launched with 6 local partners. We signed on 2 restaurants, then 4.
then a small grocery co-op in northern Iowa that invited me to give a talk on sustainable sourcing. Every time I wanted to give up, and I still had those moments, I'd look at Grandpa sitting by the window in his flannel robe, sipping coffee and scribbling notes on my marketing flyers like a retired editor. "You miss farming?" I asked him once. He didn't even look up from the paper. "I miss meaning," he said. Then he looked at me. "But you've given me that again." It wasn't just him who changed. I did too. I started standing taller, speaking with more certainty. There's something powerful about being trusted with someone else's legacy. It humbles you, but it also strengthens you in a way that money never could. I'd go to community events and people would shake my hand like I was someone, not because I inherited land, but because I earned respect. And all the while Charles stayed silent, until he didn't. It was a Tuesday. Gray sky, rain falling like whispers on the window. Grandpa was napping. I was answering emails when I saw the subject line. A conversation? It was from Charles. No greeting, just 2 sentences. "I think we should talk. I'd like to see Dad." I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what not to say. I closed the laptop, made tea, waited for Grandpa to wake up. "Do you want to see him?" I asked gently, handing him his cup. He stared out the window for a long time. "I don't know," he said finally. "Does he want to see me, or does he want to be seen by me?" I didn't press, because that answer said more than a yes ever could. 3 days passed. Charles didn't follow up. No phone call. No knock at the door. Just that one cryptic email sitting in my inbox like an unopened letter from someone I once loved and no longer recognized. I didn't delete it. Not because I needed it, but because Grandpa hadn't given an answer, and I wasn't going to be the one to make that choice for him. On Friday morning, as we sat side by side at the breakfast table, Grandpa stirring sugar into his oatmeal with the kind of patience only old farmers possess, he finally spoke. "I think I'll see him," he said, almost casually. I looked up from my coffee. "You sure?" "No," he admitted, "but I think it's time. Time. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation. Just time." We agreed it would happen in public. Neutral ground. A small diner on the edge of town where the waitresses didn't care who you were, only whether you left a tip. Grandpa wore his nicest cardigan, the one with the elbow patches, and combed his hair 3 times before leaving the apartment. I offered to go with him, but he said no. "This is between me and the past," he said, with a soft smile. "You stay in the present." So I watched from the window as he shuffled into the cab, cane in hand, back straight, jaw set. And I prayed, silently, that this wouldn't reopen wounds that had only just begun to heal. He came back an hour later, didn't speak for a while, just poured himself a glass of water and sat down in his chair like nothing had happened. I didn't ask, not yet. I let him sit with it. Finally, he said, "He looks thinner." "Charles?" He nodded. "Did he say what he wanted?" Grandpa gave a half shrug.
It was more like
apology,
regret
sort of.
without accountability. Like he's sad he lost everything, but still doesn't understand why he lost it. I waited. "There was a part of me," Grandpa continued, "that wanted to reach across the table, to take his hand, to say, 'It's okay, I still love you.'" He paused. "But I didn't." "Why not?" I asked softly. "Because it wouldn't be the truth. I love who he was, not who he became, and he needs to sit with that, not be rescued from it."
That night, after Grandpa went to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the email again. A conversation? No, Charles. You didn't want a conversation. You wanted cleansing. You wanted to step back into the light without ever sitting in the dark. And some redemption? You have to earn. The next day, Grandpa handed me an envelope. "I want you to mail this for me," he said. It was addressed to Charles. No return address, no extra notes, just a single, sealed envelope with his steady handwriting on the front. I didn't ask what was inside. I didn't need to. Some things, even in the closest relationships, are meant to be private. Not secrets, but boundaries. And Grandpa had earned the right to draw his own lines now. We heard nothing after that. No more emails, no texts, no follow-up, and somehow that was more satisfying than any argument, any courtroom battle, any final word shouted across a lawn. Because Charles wasn't just out of our lives. He was out of our story, not erased, never erased, but written into the past where he belonged, as a cautionary tale maybe, as a ghost we'd already made peace with. Weeks passed. The air grew colder. Grandpa's health didn't decline, but it didn't improve either. Some days were stronger than others, but every morning, like clockwork, he'd get dressed, sit by the window, and ask about FarmLink. How many farms now? 8, I'd say, or 11, or one morning, 17. Each number made his eyes crinkle a little more. "That's what legacy should look like," he whispered once. "Not a house, not a trust fund, but something that lives." I didn't cry in front of him, but that night I did, quietly, gratefully. Because he wasn't just my grandfather. He was the man who helped me believe that doing the right thing, loving the right way, was never, ever wasted. Even when the world tried to tell you otherwise, you don't realize how much a person has changed your life until you find them in the smallest things. A chipped coffee mug, the worn armrest of an old chair, the echo of their humming down a hallway you've walked 100 times, but that suddenly feels unfamiliar without their presence. I began noticing that with Grandpa, little by little, not because he was disappearing, but because he had become part of everything. It was in the way I folded laundry, the way I stirred my soup, the way I paused before speaking, thinking carefully about words, the way he always did. Even in silence, he filled the room. We spent most of our evenings in quiet. Sometimes he'd read. Other times we'd listen to the radio, not really paying attention to what was playing. And some nights, when his knees ached too much to move from his chair, he'd just sit there and watch the streetlights flicker on. "You ever think about going back?" I asked him once, meaning the farm or Minnesota or the life before all this. He shook his head slowly. "No, that life is done. I don't mourn it. I honor it." "What's the difference?" "Mourning holds you in place. Honor lets you carry it with you." Because it was one of those things that didn't need to be answered right away. One morning, I found him in the corner of the living room, sorting through an old wooden box. His memory box. Photographs, dog tags, newspaper clippings, Grandma's wedding ring tied with a ribbon. He held each item like it was sacred, like it breathed. He didn't speak for a long time, just touched, turned, remembered. When he noticed me watching, he smiled faintly. "Cleaning house." "Getting rid of stuff?" I asked, worried. "No, just choosing what to leave behind." And then he added, "For you." I sat beside him and picked up a photograph, him and Grandma standing in front of the old barn, arms around each other, her hair caught mid-laugh. "You miss her?" I asked. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Later that week, I came home to find a note on the table in Grandpa's handwriting. It wasn't a farewell. It was a list, titled, "The Things Worth Keeping." 1. Forgiveness you never got, but gave anyway. 2. Friends who show up without needing to be asked. 3. A sweater with holes but memories in the cuffs. 4. The smell of coffee in the morning. 5. A name you can say with pride. 6. A choice you made when no one was looking. 7. A quiet room where you're not afraid to sleep. 8. A child who becomes a home. 9. Love that doesn't ask to be repaid. 10. Peace that doesn't come from winning, but from letting go. I sat there reading it over and over again, hands trembling. It was like he had reached into my chest and spoken directly to the quietest parts of me. FarmLink hit its first funding goal that month. I signed a deal with a regional supplier, started hiring. Nothing huge, but enough. Enough to move us out of the apartment above the laundromat and into a modest 2-bedroom place near the edge of town. When I showed Grandpa the lease, he looked at me and said, "You're building." Not in the physical sense, in the legacy sense. I think that meant more to him than anything else, more than the money, more than the court battles, more than Charles ever could have offered him. Because he saw something in me that reminded him of Grandma, of the farm, of resilience that didn't shout, but endured. On his 85th birthday, I baked him an apple pie. We didn't throw a party. He didn't want noise, just the two of us, and a candle. When I asked him to make a wish, he looked at me and said, "I already got it." I laughed, expecting him to joke, but he just smiled and blew out the flame, and in that flicker of darkness before the light returned, I felt it, the full weight of everything we'd walked through, and everything we'd left behind. That night, as I tucked a blanket around him and kissed his forehead, he whispered something I'll never forget. "You made my life right again, Danny." It wasn't grand, it wasn't poetic, but it was perfect. Because sometimes the things we keep aren't heirlooms or houses or handwritten wills. Sometimes they're moments. Moments that prove you didn't just survive the fire. You carried someone else through it. And when they walked out the other side, they were whole again because of you. The new place wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. It had clean walls, soft light in the mornings, and just enough space for two people who didn't need much, only each other. Grandpa picked the smaller bedroom. "I don't need more than a corner and a window," he said, eyes twinkling as he shuffled his few belongings into place. He hung one photo on the wall, him and Grandma, of course, and lined up a few books beside his bed. That was it. No reminders of the house he left behind. No shrines to the past, just the essentials. And me? I set up my workspace in the kitchen. FarmLink had grown fast, faster than I'd planned, but it was still grounded in the same things: trust, relationships, and doing what was right even when it was hard. The investors didn't care that I lived in a modest rental or that I didn't have an MBA. They cared that I delivered, that I showed up, that my numbers matched my heart. And that, I realized, was the difference between what Charles built and what I was building. I visited the old farmhouse once, the one Grandpa had sold years ago. It wasn't ours anymore, of course. A new family had moved in. But the land still felt familiar, like the bones of a place that once raised me still remembered my steps. I didn't walk up to the door, didn't ask for a tour. I just stood at the edge of the field and let the wind wrap around me. The rows of wheat were gone, replaced by soybeans now. But the soil, the air, still sacred. I brought a small jar with me, scooped a bit of earth into it, took it home and placed it on the shelf next to Grandpa's photo, not because we needed the land back, but because we never truly lost it. A few weeks later, I got an invitation in the mail. No sender name on the envelope, just thick parchment and calligraphy I recognized too well. It was from Charles. He was getting remarried, again. I stared at it for a long time, not because I was shocked, but because of what was tucked inside. A handwritten note, not long, not dramatic, just 3 lines. I still don't understand what I did wrong, but I know I lost you. I hope you're happy. Tell Dad I hope he's doing well. I didn't show it to Grandpa, not because I was hiding it, but because I knew what he'd say. Some things don't need a response. Some stories don't need revisiting. Forgiveness isn't always reconciliation. And closure? Sometimes it's simply not answering. That night, I lit a candle, not for Charles, but for peace, real peace, the kind that lets you sleep without carrying other people's regrets. Grandpa watched me from his chair, eyes soft. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "I am." And I meant it. Not just in the moment, but deep in my bones. Because for the first time in a long time, the past wasn't pulling at me. It was resting, right where it belonged. Spring came early that year. The frost melted fast, and soft green shoots appeared along the sidewalks, peeking through cracks in the pavement like hope pushing up through hardship. Grandpa noticed it before I did. He'd sit on the porch every morning now, wrapped in a flannel blanket, a mug of black coffee in one hand and a notebook in the other. "Everything's waking up again," he said one morning. "Even the things that looked dead all winter." I followed his gaze. Cherry blossoms were beginning to stretch toward the sun, and in that moment, I realized, so were we. FarmLink hit a milestone that month. 50 local farms, 12 distribution partnerships, 3 new hires, including a young woman from our neighborhood who reminded me so much of myself it startled me. She asked once during lunch, "How did you even start this?" And I told her the truth. I didn't start it for the money. I started it because someone I loved believed in me when I couldn't even pay my own bills. Because he reminded me that just because people overlook you doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means they're too blind to see what's growing. She smiled at that, took another bite of her sandwich, and said, "Then I guess we're watering." We planted a small garden in the backyard that season. Nothing fancy, just a few raised beds, some tomato vines, green beans, herbs, and wildflowers to bring the bees. Grandpa called it his therapy. He'd spend hours out there with his hands in the dirt, humming the same tune I remembered from my childhood, the one he used to whistle when fixing the tractor, or painting the barn, or watching the clouds roll in before a storm. "Feels good to build again," he told me, as we gently tucked a basil plant into the soil. And I thought about what he'd said months ago, that mourning holds you in place, but honor lets you carry something forward. This garden, it wasn't mourning the farm, it was carrying it forward. One evening I walked outside and found Grandpa sitting among the wildflowers. Sunset was bleeding into the sky, warm golds and soft purples melting together like paint on a canvas. He looked peaceful, serene in a way I hadn't seen him in years. He turned to me slowly. "You know," he said, voice quiet, "I thought I'd leave behind a house, some money, a family name." He looked around the garden. "But I think this is better." I swallowed hard, because I knew what he meant. He wasn't talking about death. He was talking about completion, a full circle, A life not just lived, but redeemed. Weeks passed. Life unfolded gently. Grandpa's strength waned a bit more each day. He never complained, never asked for anything, but I could feel it. He was winding down, not in fear, not in sorrow, just readiness. And when it finally came, it came softly. One Sunday morning, I brought him coffee, like always, only to find him still in bed, eyes closed, a smile on his lips, as if he had fallen asleep remembering something warm. He was gone. But he was home. The funeral was small, just family, friends, neighbors from the market, no pomp, no speeches, just memories shared over pie and coffee in the backyard where the garden bloomed a little fuller that day, as if the earth itself was saying goodbye. I planted a fig tree for him the next morning, right in the center of the garden, and I tucked that small jar of Minnesota soil beneath the roots. Let it return to him. Let him grow again in the place he helped restore. Later that week, I found a final letter, tucked inside his memory box, underneath a faded seed packet labeled Avery Corn, 1982. It was addressed simply, "To Danny, my harvest. You took the broken pieces I left behind and built something whole. You didn't just rescue me, you reminded me who I was. And you gave me something I thought I'd lost, the right to be proud of my life. I won't be there to see all that you'll grow, but I already know you'll plant more than food. You'll plant truth, honor, love. You'll bloom where others burn. Because that's what legacy really is, leaving something better than what you were given. You've done that. You are my better. I love you always. Grandpa." I sat on the porch that night with that letter in my lap and tears drying on my cheeks, and I knew in the deepest part of me that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Not to Charles, not to the world, not even to myself, because I'd already won, quietly, completely, and with roots that would outlast us all. If this story touched something deep in your heart, if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or like the only one standing for what's right, then this space is for you. Because you're not alone.
Maybe you've been
Maybe
quietly
you're the
carrying the
Danielle in your
weight
family.
while someone else took the credit. Maybe you've had to fight for your worth without applause, without acknowledgement, just like she did. But let this story remind you, the quiet ones aren't weak. They're just building something that lasts. If you believe that real legacy is built on love, not control, if you know what it means to protect someone even when no one's watching, then like this video. Share it with someone who needs hope. And tell us in the comments, what are you building that no one sees yet, but one day will bloom? Your voice matters here, and your story might be the very thing someone else needs to hear tonight.